What does a perfectionistic environment consist of?
So, what does it consist of? So, when it comes to environments in sport, from a psychology perspective, we think about behaviors ultimately. So, what behaviors do people engage in, and then behaviors come from people like coaches, and coaches are important because they set the training standards. They decide what expectations should be encouraged in that environment. They decide what reward should be offered, if any, what punishment should be offered, if any. They choose the team. They're really important in terms of sort of shaping that environment. And parents equally could be the people who were interested in their behavior, and that's because they offer tangible support. From my own experience, I had parents who drove me to all my games, stood through the rain, were sort of shoulder to cry on when I missed a penalty in a cup final. They're really important from tangible but esteemed support. And some parents offer tactical advice. Tell you how you could do better or what you could focus on. And so we're interested in their behaviors when it comes to environments. And their behaviors are really important because it builds a sort of psychological atmosphere that athletes pick up on. So athletes themselves start to realize that there's certain messages and cues in the environment that come from what parents and coaches say, what they do, how they think, and how they behave around us. And therefore, any environment consists of behaviors. And I always use the example of task involving coach climate that we sometimes talk about. And in these environments, coaches engage in task-involving behaviors. So they sort of emphasize improvement, self-improvements. They get us to think positively about mistakes. They encourage cooperation rather than, competition. And that has an impact on how athletes think. And when it comes to a perfectionistic climate, we can use the very same logic. So a perfectionistic climate, therefore, consists of perfectionistic behaviors from coaches, from parents, and these, in a nutshell, or very broadly speaking, are any behaviors that make the athletes in that particular environment feel like they need to be perfect, that perfect performance is an essential requirement, and anything less than perfect performance will not be accepted, not be tolerated, not be approved of at all by these people that we're looking towards, parents, coaches, and the like. So, yeah. Anything that leads athletes to believe that they must be perfect, any behaviors that is.
That messaging that comes from parent, you think of young people that parents are where it's going to be the majority of their time spent. I reckon as you progress through, whether it's a performance environment or even into, say, professional sport, the parent coach time allocated to that individual might switch. You're spending more. I spent more time with my coaches as I got to an adolescent than I probably did with my parents, and vice versa, right? But as a young person, you're spending time with them. The messaging, though, from parents, that messaging about performance or outward presentation, it doesn't even have to be sport related, I guess, and performance related. The messaging, is it more implicit or explicit?
I think it's a good question. I think it could be a combination of both. So like there could be instances where it's more explicit in terms of you need to perform in this particular way or achieve this particular standard. But in sport, most times it's probably more implicit. There's not necessarily always an ideal, perfect performance when you think about cricket, football, rugby, and team-based sports, for example. There's no ideal performance that I think is that symbolizes a perfect performance. So a lot of the messages regarding expectations are more implicit and are more sort of anything that the parent does or coach does, for argument's sake, that would lead the athlete to feel like the standards that are required from me here are beyond what others would maybe regard as being a successful athlete. They are beyond what's required in this environment. They're unrealistic in some way, shape, or form. So it's not that they're saying you need to score this many goals or make this many runs, or if you don't do this, I'm not going to be happy. But it's just this sort of constant pressure to continuously push and do more. That's the feeling that would be relevant to the athletes, rather than a specific sort of standard that they would have emphasized time and time again. So I think that's more likely what it would be.
Yeah, I feel you never get told. Well, I've always spoken to people about minding their language in more a sense of, or I've just, I guess, even just from my side, I've tried to mind my language as much as I can for not only people I know and work with, but actually myself, which is, I think it was Dr. Steve Peters in his book Chimp Paradox first put into my mind shoulding all over yourself, to stop shoulding all over yourself, stop using the word should. It's a stressful word, and it creates an expectation of how life should behave. And then I started looking out for sort of should's ugly cousins, which would be need, I have to, musts, all of those words that created a stress around not only yourself, but then if you're working with someone, and then straight away it's like yellow minis, right? As soon as you say it, you're now looking for it. And my mind is just activated to finding this out all the time and looking, seeking it. And every time I see a parent or a coach saying, you need to do this, you go, there it is. There's another sort of death by a thousand paper cuts in terms of you're just nailing home that perfect coffin that you need to be at that level. So I think for me it's you don't see it as in that is I'm going to sit you down and say this performance has to be perfect. It's kind of implied slowly, but kind of implicitly and explicitly in just those small little moments for me that just happen.
Yeah,
I think the other one for me is actions by the parent. What is what is it in terms of creating a perfectionistic parent or environment that can be led by their own actions?
yeah. So I think when you think about like actions and what parents do explicitly or implicitly, it's really useful to look at theory of where perfectionism comes from. So the theories are useful insofar as they basically describe to us in quite vivid detail what these parents are, what they look like, and what they do. So you talk about actions and talk about the implicit or explicit behaviors they engage in. These theories are really useful for helping us to paint a picture of what a perfectionistic parent would look like in terms of their behaviors and actions. So they're based on theory. It's things like, importantly, obviously, setting unrealistic expectations for their child. So any action that tells the child that they need to perform to an upper level, beyond what is required, um, and sometimes in combination with that, being extremely critical of their child. So it's a particularly damning combination of them two behaviors that I think is important. So not just constantly re-emphasizing or emphasizing that these upper standards are required, but um, criticizing them in every instance when they fail to achieve them standards. So I think critical behavior is definitely an action that would fall under that sort of umbrella of a perfectionistic type of behavior from a parent. Um, I always think about the parents who who as soon as the child gets in the car, tells them, that was shocking, that was absolutely, you know, X, Y, or Z curse word. That sort of criticism of even small mistakes would be an important behavior. Um, we think about parents who are controlling, in their actions. So that could be through promising rewards if you meet a certain perfectionistic standard. If you perform in this way, or if you avoid mistakes in today's performance, we will buy you your favorite present, or take you to your favorite restaurant, or take you to McDonald's on the way home. It could be that offer of some tangible sort of reward. That's the action that motivates perfect performance. Or even more persuasively, it could be the manipulation of their warmth, a parental warmth almost, in terms of how approving they are of a particular performance. I always go back to I recently watched the Peter Crouch documentary. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but in one of the episodes it talks about his dad who was unhappy with one of his performances and got in the car and left him at the academy to walk several miles home in the cold, let's say. Um, but it's that sort of persuasive behavior that it tells the child in this case that they're unhappy with their performance without actually saying anything. It's that sort of, I'm going to be cold and distant and not, I'm going to ignore you to the point where I'm going to appeal to your inner sort of regulations and forces that make you want to be perfect to avoid any sense of shame or guilt. So it's not just about extrinsic rewards in the form of prizes and presents and gifts, but it's that sort of more insidious form of contingent approval almost. Um, and then lastly, in terms of actions, it could be that parents are just constantly worried around their child, constantly reminding them that mistakes are bad, should be avoided, that are going to reflect badly on you as an athlete, but also me as a parent. And these are all sort of, a collective, if you like, bunch of behaviors that parents could engage in, actions that they could put into place that would lead to this perfectionistic environment almost. And some parents could do all of them. Some parents might do one and not the other. So there's a sort of heterogeneity amongst perfectionistic parents. There's not two in the same mold necessarily. But yeah, like just in terms of talking about actions there, it's high expectations, criticism, control through various mediums, and also that hyper vigilance almost towards potential mistakes to the point where you sort of thwarting any sense of their exposure to mistakes and learning from stressful situations, and re-emphasizing this idea that the child themselves the athlete themselves should be worried about mistakes, which is not necessarily a good thing that we know about. And you said before about fear of failure, for example. It's not a good thing to be worried about mistakes.
You touched on it with personality, and I'd been thinking about this, whether high neuroticism would link really closely with a perfectionistic parent or coach, just through the need of wanting to control something and feeling that there is no sense of control, and wanting to cross all the T's and dot all the I's, and so is there a link between personality, especially the big five? Is there a link there with perfectionistic parents and personality?
Yeah, there will be some link, definitely. I think in terms of all them different behaviors that I described, that a perfectionistic parent could exhibit, neuroticism is probably most clearly linked to the anxiousness component there. So, like in some ways, you could call it a worry conducive type of behavior where any sort of worry that the parent has about what mistakes mean, how they should be avoided, how they could lead to a sort of a flaw in the way they're perceived as a parent, perhaps. That sort of neurotic belief about the world and about mistakes and about how we're viewed by others, that could be clearly expressed to the child. And in that sense, a highly perfectionistic parent could also be highly neurotic from that sort of anxiousness, signaling to others that their anxiety regarding mistakes and imperfections and flaws. Um, as for some of the other behaviors that were mentioned, they probably extend beyond just neuroticism alone. So the super critical parent is, for example, not necessarily neurotic. They could be more. Some of the darker personality traits, perhaps, some of the more sort of Machiavellian or narcissistic almost. And there is definitely some sort of narcissistic element, perhaps, in perfectionistic climates where the coach might be worried about how they're perceived almost, or the parent, sorry, could be worried about how they're perceived, and their need to demand relentlessly high expectations from others could be because they're worried about, because they believe that the expectations of the athletes, of their sons, their daughters, for example, will reflect somehow on themselves as a parent. And if they're perfectionistic, then it's almost like a defense mechanism to demand of others a standard that you want to reflect well on yourself almost. So in some parents, there could definitely be that sort of like narcissistic self-protection component almost.
I 100% was going to go towards the dark triad and just say there has to be a link with narcissism, Machiavellianism, and a perfectionistic parent or coach. And that for me was this thought around a more broader topic, which is, do you think that perfectionism in parents, leaders, coaches is actually getting worse because of the need to look good, the need to uphold a certain standard and image that we are now forced to see through social media, information overload that we wouldn't have perhaps had in the past? Because if you can see the level that someone's at more often now, then it surely has an impact on you. And I think of it kind of like this optimizing parenting. You're Are you the optimal parent? And I've got friends who are parents, and they're looking at, you could be looking at the person next to you and going, I need to be at that standard. They're parenting so well, or they're coaching so well, and can I get there? So that Machiavellianism and would then kick in surely off the back of a narcissistic tendency. What do you think?
Yeah, so I go back to one of the first things you said there about whether it's getting worse. I think I don't know if you've came across the term before, but it's super interesting, this idea of the professionalization of youth sport. So it I think it's a term that's coined by Dan Gould, and it probably appeared first at like 2009, but it's since reared its head again more recently. And it's this idea that rather than youth sport context being about the child and the development of lots of important areas of their life beyond just performance, albeit performance being really important, but the development of things like psychosocial skills, communication, for example, coping skills when it comes to stress. This is how we often view youth sport, but more and more we move away from that sort of model. There's evidence now that more so than ever before, we adopt more of an elite entertainment model of sport at the youth level, which is very different from what I've just described. So it's a model of sport that focuses on competitive success as the sort of principal game. It focuses on or prioritizes early sport specialization. So this idea that from a young age we need to focus on one sport and one sport only at the expense of sampling lots of other sports and learning lots of other skills, many of which would be transferable, of course, and others of which may be actually at a higher level than the sport you actually started out playing. And it focuses on other aspects like placing a huge sort of emphasis on rewards, trophies, medals, rankings, for example. So all the things that you would think about as a former elite athlete yourself, and what you did in terms of intense training, multiple days of training, and applying that same sort of model to a youth sport context. So there's evidence now that more so than ever before, that's what we see at youth levels. And you only need to talk to parents who have children who play sport to get any sort of anecdotal evidence that these environments exist everywhere. Or look at social media, like you said. The amount of times that I'll go, I occasionally visit Facebook and see a video of somebody I went to school with who's got their child in a additional one-on-one football training session with a professional coach at the age of like 8 years old. And I'm thinking, what on earth is happening where when I was younger, you'd go to training once a week and then you'd play a game. And now people go to training multiple times a week. They do complex tactical set play and all these other weird things. And they have these additional training sessions, which I think is just bizarre. But there's definitely more of a shift towards this model of youth sport, and it comes with dangers, and it comes with pictures of parents yelling at their child. It comes with parents berating referees and officials. It comes with uh, undue pressure put on children. And it also comes with things like potential for burnout, the development of cynical attitudes towards sport, as in, what's the point? I'm no good at sport. It comes with the potential of overuse injuries if you're training more than you need to be, or in a way that's more complicated than you need for your age and maturation. It comes with problems for injury. So it's not a good look for sport, I don't think. And there's evidence that's linked to that it encourages perfectionistic behavior implicitly from parents and from coaches who just think this is the way sport should be. I think there's evidence to say that more perfectionistic parents um, have more positive views on this type of model of sport. So they think that it's a good thing that should be encouraged. I'm talking specifically about this view of early specialization, but that's part of the model, obviously. And so if you're more perfectionistic as a parent and you're more authoritative in your sort of parenting style, you're more likely to view that way of sport as being a good thing, something that should be encouraged, revered, something that works. So I think it's becoming more of a problem, and it's to a large extent accounting for a lot of the perfectionist parenting behaviors that you may have came across.
Well, I think you touched on something there that I've been thinking about a fair amount, which is the draw for the high standards and high expectations and the drive and the motivation, all the perfectionistic strivings that exist within a perfectionistic individual, either parent or child, teenager, adult, whatever. That is such an attractive draw because we know that without those, you're not really going to create some form of success or high achievement. Yes, the cost is going to be burnout, it's going to be injuries, it's going to be really lonely potentially, it's going to be a hard slog. But does that high standard, that drive, and all these shiny objects have far greater pull? And then from a parent's point of view, I think you get one story such as the Tiger Woods, where every parent then thinks it's got to be done like that, and that's the route to success. And you think, well, LeBron James's upbringing wasn't like that. His mother wasn't like Earl Woods, and it didn't really work out like that. And it's interesting that I've just come and I'm in the tennis world, and that is for me where this is just huge. Perfectionistic parenting in tennis for me is massive because you've got a parent on the sidelines usually traveling around with the kid, and the kid is in full control of their sport. Then they can't get any sideline coaching. Well, you can in some tournaments now, but they can't speak to them. But the parents are like tearing their hair out from the side. So they spend 2, maybe 3 sets as a junior watching this match unfold however it will, and then at the end when the kid comes off court, that's where it just kicks off. I would hate to be in a perfectionistic parent that's in tennis in their car after a tournament. I would hate to see that. I can't imagine the amount of maladaptive behaviors that are going on there. But it's yeah, it's do we do we run the risk of trying to remove some of these perfectionistic strivings, all the positive things of perfectionism? Do we run the risk of losing that high achievement from it?
Yeah, so my view on this is that when there's an issue with terminology often in the field that I believe where I would probably argue personally that perfection standards are unrealistic, unobtainable standards. So I struggle to see a situation when setting unrealistic, unobtainable standards would ever be useful for a child.
Can I ask you something on that?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
that unrealistic standard, that would be dependent on the level of which the individual's at, right? So it's I just say this, like, I'm learning Spanish, and I'm about to go to Spain for 2 months to continue practicing, but I think of this as me wanting to be fluent at the end of next week. Do you know what I mean? That's an unrealistic
Yeah,
standard,
yeah, yeah.
right? So is it just comparative to where you are right now?
I think it's comparative to where you are right now. Yeah. So standards need to be need to be realistic given all the constraints that you can factor in. So when I often talk about perfectionistic standards, I always use the example of things like have you taken into consideration who your opponent is, what your current injury status is, how your form's been recently, how your training's been going. Like these are all reasonable factors to take into consideration when trying to set what you think should be a realistic goal. And perfectionistic standards ignore all of that. As in, it's you want this upper level of performance that is not only very likely unobtainable, so beyond what you're able to achieve based on your own abilities and it's yeah, unobtainable, unlikely to be achieved, and therefore is very rarely going to lead to any positive outcomes. So that's what I would always argue when talking about the supposed adaptiveness of perfectionistic standards. I would always say unrealistic standards are rarely likely to be beneficial to anybody, but you can still set high standards without them being perfectionistic. So I've used terms like you can set standards that are high but optimally optimally challenging. So you are pushing that athlete to reach a standard that is high, but importantly is optimally challenging in the sense that they can still meet that goal given their ability, given the other situational constraints that I mentioned. And to me, that wouldn't be a perfectionistic standard. That would just be a high standard, a conscientious standard. And I think that that would come with the success that you described previously. That's needed in more elite youth sport contexts, so academies and the like. If you were ever going to set high standards for your child as a parent, I would be focusing more on them types of standards rather than perfectionistic standards, if that makes sense. So I always use that as a sort of a way of describing what I mean by perfectionistic is I mean unrealistic, unobtainable, not taking into account all these important factors. So for me, that you would be failing your child almost to have them types of perfectionistic standards. But the alternative would be optimally challenging, flexible. You're willing to adapt when things go wrong. A perfectionistic standard wouldn't adapt. It's rigid. You either are successful or you're not. So I think when you think about quality motivation, you need these optimally challenging, flexible, high standards. Fair enough. That will lead to success, but that's not the same as the relentless, tyrannical, demanding standards that would break a child and would make them, resentful to you, perhaps as a parent. That would make them fall out of love with sport. That would make them burn out, injured, and all the other things that I described previously. So, that's kind of where my head is on that sort of argument.
Have you spent much time around Patrick Goudreau's model of excellence-ism?
Yeah. So
Uh,
that's a great point.
yeah, I loved it. I had him on the show, and when he brought it forward and I'd read about it, I thought it was ideal, just using the idea of excellence. And then what I actually thought of was when I had Gordon Flett on the show, Gordon had spoken about adaptable perfectionism. So, because we use the story in my case, was a rigid perfectionist would be someone who, uh, an example for me was I would go running, say at some stage in my junior career, I would run almost every day or every other day. And even if it was hailing and there was a storm outside, I would still go. I wouldn't even consider that it would be an option going in the treadmill at a local gym. It's because I'd set this standard. I was like, I have to go outside and do it. And even if it was 1 a.m., I would still do it and just not willing to budge. And so I thought a mold of that excellencism and adaptable perfectionism, being able to adapt your perfectionism based on what's in front of you, is surely a much more adaptive way to be, just because you can have a scenario where you go, what is required of me today, and what does an excellent performance look like today? Because even if you put it in a sport context, and my sport, cricket's a great one, if I've got an athlete that says the only way today that would be successful is if I get 100, and you bowl the other team out for 99, even if you score 99 runs, you've fallen short of your standard and your expectation, and there will be a small voice in your head that will be berating you, like very either loudly or just subtly for the rest of the day, saying, "But you could have had this, you could have got that." And for me, it's then saying, okay, adaptably, you would go, "What is the best for me on today?"
Yeah, I think you've raised a lot of important points there, and in the literature at the moment, there's quite a lot of these sort of similar notions of adaptable perfectionism. So you mentioned the Goudreau's a model of excellence-ism, and that is one of them. And I know that Professor Andrew Hill talks a little bit about imperfectionism. So I know it's this idea of a similar concept. And then there's also some work from a sort of REBT perspective. So looking at taking the irrationality out of perfectionism almost. So, you know, can you be a rational perfectionist? Now, I don't know where I fully stand on this, but it's the idea that, can you still have them extremely high standards? You're going to push yourself to pursue excessively high standards, but be okay with yourself when you don't quite get there. Go again, for example. You're not going to berate yourself, as you mentioned. You're not going to sort of tie all sense of self-worth to the meeting of them standards, but you're going to continuously push for them. Now, whether or not that person is a perfectionist is one important argument, and whether an adaptive perfectionist exists. There's a famous line about healthy perfectionism being an oxymoron, for example, with some of Greenspan's work. But I do think there's still a place for all of that work. I don't care so much about the labeling. It's this idea that surely we want lots of athletes in high performance settings to push themselves to meet these high standards, but without the sort of criticism, rumination, brooding almost about mistakes. And a lot of interventions in perfectionism focus on reducing the concerns element of perfectionism only. So we're not going to try and reduce your standards because we know that they're necessary. We're going to try and focus more on the baggage that comes with perfectionism. So I think all of these ideas about excellence-ism, imperfectionism, and rational perfectionism all have a place in that regard, as in help us to, as practitioners or as researchers, to help athletes to not drop their standards, but to help with some of the sort of helplessness and hopelessness that comes with perfectionism. So yeah, definitely a place for that.
I think you're right. Even just thinking of my own experience as a perfectionist, I almost feel I can't remove the standards. Like that feels so baked into my psychology now. But the thing that I manage the most is all of the maladaptive. It's the self-doubt, it's the procrastination, it's the concern over making a mistake. I remember even in one of the one of my module exams in my master's was I literally had to write a phrase in front of me because I was doing a viva to someone who had spent 20, 30 years in the psychology research space. I literally had to write a phrase saying, "You're not where he's at,"
Mm.
and just be and underneath was like, "Be okay with that."
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it was this ego diminishing phrase that was just saying, "You don't need to be at his level right now. You don't need to be at that standard," and it was trying to remove all those things. And I find this interesting in young kids right now, is this tussle between they want to present such a perfect version of themselves and a image that they've got the confidence and they know that. But then when you speak to them or they speak to you privately, they're talking about the self-doubt, the criticism, how it's hurting them so much, but they're just so drawn to wanting to have to prove themselves and have high standards over here, and especially in sport, but they're just riddled with the anxiety that comes with it, all the maladaptive behaviors.
Yeah, it's complicated because in a lot of cases, the what defines perfectionists is not the standards so much as the what underlies the standards, and that's often the fear of failure, the self doubt, the criticism, the need for approval. So, it it's a tricky job, I guess, for any practitioner who wants to 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 remove that baggage without also affecting any sort of standards that people learn to of almost internalize into who they are as a person. I am somebody who pushes themselves and sets high standards. And I think when you talk to perfectionists, there's lots of qualitative research that's been done where one of the biggest struggles is the fear of letting go of their perfectionism, for fear of dropping standards, for fear of not being this sort of high achieving person anymore. So, I think there's a pretty useful text by Roz Shafran on overcoming perfectionism. Um, and the key message that is put forward in that text is that they're going to try and help people to manage their perfectionism without having to compromise on their standards. So I think, if it's a tricky job, but something that can be achieved in terms of helping people to keep standards that are high, optimally challenging, likely to lead to success in a sporting context or others, but really work on the concerns that come with perfectionism. And there's a lot of things that you can do, like it helps you to learn how to switch off, for example. So I don't know if you've heard about switching on and switching off, in terms of switching off your high standards if and when you need to. So you leave the sport environment and you switch off for when you get back to your family, and you don't carry that home with you in the way that is going to impact not just how you feel in sport, but how your partner feels about you, how your kids feel about you, and your ability to be present in other contexts. So switching on and switching off is an important skill that I would say any highly perfectionistic athlete needs. Other skills are things like learning to differentiate success and failure as something that's not black and white, as in there are degrees of success and degrees of failure. So that's important, not to have that sort of all or nothing thinking that is likely to lead to success and happiness in the rare occasions you perform extremely well, but for the most part, bitter disappointments in all of the situations. So that can be managed through learning about degrees of success and failure, for example. So, but yeah, the idea of switching on and switching off is something that I try to adopt, because I can be perfectionistic sometimes in how I think about my work, for example. Um, but I've learned better to switch it on and switch it off in different scenarios.
As you're talking now, I'm trying to think f whether my perfectionism was driven through the idea of trying to strive for the success of those high standards, or actually just to not be seen as not at that standard and avoid the failure of what that could cost. So it's, do you want to be seen as a perfectionist? Because with it is someone who has high standards, who's driven, is motivated, creative. Is the drive to be that because you want to be that, or because you actually are just trying to avoid
Mm.
not being that?
I think it's
That for me is a quite big one.
Yeah, just as you're speaking there, it's very complicated. And I think sometimes it's not a case of either or, as in a lot of perfectionists are driven by both motives, in combination with one another. So there's a concept called like over striving, I believe, and that kind of describes a lot of perfectionists where they're simultaneously motivated by the need to you know, and the need to gain success, but equally the need to avoid failure. And it leads to this sort of like complicated melee of motives, almost, where they're conflicted by both ends of they're burning the candle from both ends, is if that's the saying, where and trying to equally reach some standard of success at the same time as they're trying to avoid the failure of the other at the other end. So it's quite a complicated motivational profile.
I also think when it comes to parenting and perfectionistic parents, you never find, in my experience, someone who has been, say, an elite athlete that tends to present a lot of the perfectionistic tendencies. My theory, massively bro sciencing this one, is that they have gone through a perfectionistic upbringing and experience and know how much the concerns, the maladaptive behaviors suck and what it leads to. And so they do their utmost to not be that. They're almost driven away from that experience and don't want to present that to their own kids. Don't get me wrong, there are other parents that have high standards and present it. But I tend to see that in sport specifically, that if you've got a parent who has been a really high profile businessman or woman, that they put perfectionistic standards on an athlete, but if the parent has been a high performance athlete, they tend to not. That's only, and I only can, my only thinking is that I've gone through this myself and I just don't want my child to go through that. Whereas the parent who's from a corporate world doesn't fully understand the elite environment of sport.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I also don't have like a sort of a strong evidence-based answer to it, but I've got my own sort of contrived ideas. And I agree with what you say. And sometimes where if you're an elite athlete, and you'll know this yourself, obviously, where you've experienced the pressures of elite sport, whether that's pressures you put on yourself or pressures that others have put on you, and you understand the stress that it can cause and the worries that come with it. Um, and therefore, if and when you've got your own child in front of you, are you really going to choose to put them under the same pressure that given that you know exactly how that feels, and given the worry and stress, that comes with it? And the other thing that I'm thinking about here is I go back to before about this idea of the professionalization of youth sport in that sort of application of this elite entertainment model. If you've been through that process, you probably have a good understanding that youth sport shouldn't be like what you experience as elite athletes. It shouldn't be the excessive training multiple days a week. It shouldn't be the same emphasis on winning. And you've probably got a better understanding that, having gone through that process yourself, and know that at them younger ages, it shouldn't be like that, and therefore it might be easier to not put your child through that same model almost, and not put them under the same stress that could be problematic. And um, as for how why other parents don't do that, perhaps it's just that lack of understanding of, that people who come into sport might just think this is the way sport is. It's about winning. It's about competitive success, and that's just how I've came to understand sport as more of an outsider, perhaps. So there's some of the thoughts that came to mind for me, is that it's about your exposure to sport will dictate how you think you should behave with your own child in that situation. And having experienced the pressures of sport, you're unlikely to want to put your child through some of that at a young age, given that it's maybe not the time for that type of behavior. Um, I think what's really telling, and what question I love to ask other people, and what question I've had asked to me, and I've heard other people talk about, is, we often talk about the so-called adaptiveness of perfectionism, or the adaptiveness of perfectionistic standards on others. And some people argue one way in terms of the fact that there's a place for it. Other people argue the other end of the spectrum. And one of the questions that helps to cut through a lot of that noise is, would you recommend that for your own child? You say that perfectionist standards are so great. Would you do that to your own child? And sometimes the answer might be yes, and then it might depend on how you define perfectionistic standards. But for me, I've got two young children, and if I'm lucky enough that one day they're interested in sport, I almost certainly would not be putting unrealistic perfectionist standards on them. I even, to some extent, worry about putting high standards on them. I think my expectations would lie elsewhere personally, and that would be more about an expectation for them to be a good teammate, to put effort in, to learn from mistakes and value their importance. That's where I would put my expectations in my own children. And, I think that the idea of what would you do to your own child is enlightening in terms of helping you to understand what you really think about these types of behaviors.
Kind of leaning back to that corporate parent and athlete, my only thinking as to why that actually happens as well is that outside of sport, most effort-based activities in terms of to get an outcome are fairly binary. So in terms of if you're running a business, you kind of know that I put this amount of effort in, there's a high possibility that I'm going to get a result here of increased income, revenue, business progresses, bang, go, barring markets changing and things like that, which are out of your control. But in sport, that is so unpredictable. It's so non-binary in that sense. You just cannot, you can put in as much effort as you want. And you see this time and time again, that you put in so much effort that you just don't get the result. And you kind of have to know that. You have to know that that's baked in the experience. And that's where, for me, the differentiator between why I think a corporate perfectionistic parent would struggle with understanding why that level of effort and what it takes to get high performance doesn't fit in sport, because there are just so many other things at play. There's just so many other elements that kick up.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. Adding to this idea that I suppose it feeds into some way of that, the lack of uh, full familiarization with what sport's all about and what it entails and what's involved in success and not success. So yeah, I think, going back to the idea of like, why would somebody who's been through the system be different? And I think that's definitely a factor. So, as an elite athlete, you would understand more about not just what that pressure feels like, but as he said, all of the components that are involved in success, and why putting undue pressure might not necessarily be a good thing because there's so many other factors that are perhaps more important, than simply just demanding high standards from the athletes.
Do you do you think being a perfectionistic parent is a form of love or control?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because I think when I go back to all the things that we've talked about today, and we've hopefully painted a reasonable picture of what a perfectionistic environment would look like, and I would argue that in no way, shape, or form do any of them really resemble loving, warming family environments for children or sporting environments. Then that would be my take on it. So I would lean away from the love perspective because I feel like if we had a sort of dimension of 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 warmth versus neglect, or warmth versus criticism, it leans more towards the critical, controlling aspects of that dimension. So I'd very much sort of suggest that it's not out of love, or love definitely isn't something that's and comes across in these environments. In fact, the opposite of love sometimes comes across, and that can lead to things like children just resenting their parents for the standards that they, force on or thrust upon them. And it's definitely a form of control, in some way, shape, or form. The simple idea here is that parents who are perfectionistic and want their child to be perfect or controlling in the sense that they want to motivate some standard in their child, and they'll use controlling strategies to get that standard. They'll like I said before, use rewards, punishments, the manipulation of their warmth, for example, to try and motivate and control children into behaving in a certain way. And as I said previously, the most persuasive form of control that you see in perfectionist environments is that sort of more subtle emotional form of control that basically appeals to the inner regulations of children, where they sort of learn, my parents don't like it when I do that, and therefore what motivates me to try and be perfect next time is going to be this need to avoid my own sense of failure or guilt or shame. So I think it's, in terms of a simple answer, I think it leans more towards the control than love. But what springs to mind for me is, do some parents just think it's tough love? Could that be the angle where I need to harden my athlete? They need to learn to deal with pressure. They need to, this is what elite sport is going to be like, and if they're going to make it, they're going to have to get used to it. That sort of tough love. So there could be that element, but I worry about that as well.
Can a perfectionistic parent actually start to unlearn perfectionism?
Yeah, I think so. Like, there's a few things that I think about with this question, and sometimes I think that it might sound contradictory, but I think sometimes a parent could be perfectionistic without being high in perfectionism, if that makes sense. So like they could engage in behaviors that are perfectionistic, but from more of a a way it's not driven by who they are deep down, is a well entrenched part of who they are, but they just do it because they think that these are the behaviors that are needed in sport. So they find themselves jumping on the bandwagon of shouting, come on, you've got to reach this standard, and oh, come on, that was terrible. And just because they learn that sport and parents behave that way. So in which case it could be a very easy switch where you just sort of reflect upon and learn about that sport maybe shouldn't be that way, or that you as a parent maybe shouldn't be that way, and therefore could be an easy switch in terms of, oh, actually I should maybe avoid saying that to my child. I should avoid the shoulds, the musts, and so on that we talked about earlier. So it could be really simple if it's not well entrenched. Maybe it's just something that you need to be aware of more, and therefore think about the way that you behave around your children. So it could be quite simple. And if it is more well entrenched as part of who you are and the standards you set for others, um, then it could be harder to change. But there's lots of evidence from sport and other contexts that we can manage our perfectionism. We can, you mentioned before about self-compassion. You talked about writing the message to yourself about saying it's okay with this, and there's evidence of self-compassionate based interventions could be important, but there's evidence of mindfulness-based approaches that could be effective in sport, acceptance, commitment therapies, CBT. The list goes on and on and on. So there are definitely avenues out there whereby parents could learn or unlearn how to avoid setting the same unrealistic standards of others. So it would take some work, but there's definitely things that could be done.
Yeah, the unlearning of perfectionism for me has come definitely from a much more mindful approach. It's come from bit of therapy that maybe later on, but definitely mindfulness has been a big thing for me. It's just the ability for, like I mentioned with shooting all over yourself, that the moment I mentioned that word, being comfortable with having an awkward interaction with someone that would be, sorry, Michael, I didn't mean to say that word. I actually didn't mean should I mean could. And you have to change yourself. And I always I almost think of it in, if I don't change that, if I don't actively do that, and I succumb to the pressure of just wanting to get the conversation done, but at the risk of me not changing the behavior that I know is not going to be adaptive for myself, then I have just let that moment slip by, and that was a really great opportunity, an opportunity to change that. And it only takes a few moments. It only takes, it's almost, you can feel yourself about to say the word, and then you go could rather than should. And I just think that for me was built off the capacity to notice where my mind was, notice where my attention was, notice what was about to happen, be a little bit slower in my ability to articulate what I was about to say, not to reduce the cadence of a conversation, but just to say the right thing, knowing that it was going to have a positive outcome. We've just very quickly, what are the risks of a parent not changing their perfectionistic tendencies?
Yeah, so I think we've very briefly touched earlier on some of the potential outcomes of this type of high pressure, highly perfectionistic, professionalized sort of worldview and behaviors in sport, and they included burnouts. I think that's something that's been looked at before, where your child might be more likely or more vulnerable to become exhausted as a consequence of their sport and participation, more likely to um, sort of devalue their sport participation, so become more cynical towards sport in terms of what's the point? My time would be better spent elsewhere doing some different activity where you as a parent might not be involved, for example. It could lead to just reduced confidence in sport. So, reduced sense of competence, more specifically, I guess, where you just no longer feel you're good enough in sport, which is never a good thing. It could lead to dropout beyond that, where you just decide sport is no longer for me. I'm going to drop out and I'm going to do something completely different, which is never a good thing. So if you want to reach the upper echelons of sport, thinking about dropping out is never nice. Never going to be a part of that journey. But more broadly, it's not good from a lifelong participation perspective. I'm somebody who's never reached the higher levels of sport, but I've consistently and happily played sport every week since I've been about 9. So I'd like to think that comes from perhaps the role my parents played in terms of they were consistently warm with me and happy with me, irrespective of how well I played. I've had times when I've uh, performed poorly. I've had times when I've maybe had the potential to go on to reach higher levels and never quite made it, and nothing ever changed. So that might have played a role in the fact that I still continue to and will continue to play sport at a Sunday league level, where I get kicked in the shins every week, but will do it because I love sport. So perhaps if parents are more perfectionistic and they don't unlearn that, you could jeopardize that sort of lifelong love of sport, which I think is never a good thing. Um, we mentioned injuries, but what I want to touch upon now, I guess, is the more obvious but concerning issue, which is it could lead your child to become extremely perfectionistic. So, if you are, it's a good chance that your child will internalize that pressure and it will form part of their personality. So when we're growing up, children's personality is very malleable. It's when it's developed and formed and shaped and put into place. And if you become highly perfectionistic as an athlete, you then are potentially vulnerable to the whole host of outcomes that come with perfectionism. So, we know now, based on 30 years of research in sport, that typically it's linked with negative outcomes, and the net outcome of being perfectionistic is, for the most part, negative. There are, of course, exceptions to the rule. We know from by autobiographies and the like that there are tennis players, rugby players, swimmers out there who admit to being self-identified perfectionists, but these are the exceptions to the rule, I would argue, where they've managed to be successful, for other factors, not successful because of their perfectionism. And I know you've discussed this elsewhere or in another episode, so I'm not going into too much detail there, but um, yeah, like, I think you run the risk of your child becoming perfectionistic, which could carry a whole host of negative outcomes for your child as well.
And the cycle repeating itself.
Yeah,
Then
basically. Yeah.
you eventually become a parent
Yeah.
and you've set the standards for your life, and then it's not changing it. And I just think, again, not only because this has just been a sort of personal journey for myself, but I just see it again, whether this is just me bringing it into my life more and now seeing it more prevalently, but or it actually being a thing that's on the rise. I don't even know if there's a way of metrically knowing whether there are more perfectionists in the world right now. I just feel like there are, because it spills over into other areas of your life. And I did speak to Andy Hill on the show, and the area of research that I've got, which is this, well, what we've been speaking about overly today, is this other orientated perfectionism, the want for someone else to be perfect, right? Driving someone else's self-prescribed perfectionism, self-orientated perfectionism, and then sort of the socially prescribed perfectionism sitting around it and fueling it maybe more. But the want for other people to be perfect, you see this even in the dating culture. You see this even in, yeah, just friendships or relationship, any relationship, that I want you to be at this level, and if you don't, I feel you're not at my expectation. And then if that isn't the case, then why be in this relationship in the first place, or should we even continue it? So I feel like it spills out of not only just high performance environments, but into just life as well.
Yeah, there's so many good examples of the destructive nature of other oriented, demanding perfection of others. So, you mentioned relationships. There's some, not necessarily good examples, but there's evidence on, like, it leads to increased conflict in marriages, for example. There's a nice study called "Caught in a Bad Romance." This idea that other oriented perfectionism breeds dyadic conflict in romantic relationships. I always go the example I like to provide to people is the film Whiplash. I don't know if you've heard or seen the film Whiplash, but if you haven't,
Oh, yes, I
well,
have, yeah.
yeah, the about the drummer, so Miles Teller
Incredible film.
and J.K. Simmons, I believe. He's the tyrannical, other-oriented perfectionist who creates an environment of extreme pressure, and yeah, you mentioned before about what the problems could be in that environment. I think you need to look no further than that example to see the destructive. That's an extreme case there, but the destructive impact that has on the psychological and physical well-being of people who are sort of exposed to that pressure. We use the example of Steve Jobs quite a lot. It was there's anecdote of Steve Jobs firing people in the lift. So in the lift at work, people would actively avoid, apparently, getting in the lift with them because they know that you would see them, be reminded that they're not good enough in some capacity, and therefore fire them on the spot. So you would be this sort of like narcissistic, other-oriented perfectionist. So that's another good example. And then if anyone's interested in gymnastics, that's rife with this type of behavior. And the Netflix documentary Cheer, once again, I'd recommend this. It paints the picture of what a perfectionistic sporting context looks like. So a coach who is highly demanding, and they all love her, which is really interesting. So that the athletes love her because they think that it's the way that she should be and that it's tough love. But you also, as the program goes on, despite this love, you see this destruction going on in the background where lots of athletes are struggling massively. So whilst they love her, they probably are not aware of the negative impact it's having on quite a lot of them from a well-being perspective. So some great examples of how it spills over from beyond sport to work to romance to any, all shapes of life.
I've got former British and Olympic gymnast Beth Tweddle hopefully coming on soon,
Right, nice.
and this is a subject that I essentially wanted to talk to her around, which is this because they're quite literally judged on a perfect performance, and it's kind of like what does that look like, and even anecdotal research or in interviews of athletes who have got a perfect 10 and said it could have been better. And it's like, okay, what's going on there? And so it's it's definitely a really interesting area that I want to ask her about.
Yeah, I think there's two things I'll just quickly mention. So like I've got personal tutees at work, and one of them told me the other day she was a gymnast, and I said, "Oh, I do this research. I want to know, like, does it exist, this environment? Have you experienced it?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, definitely. Like I can think of loads of examples." And the one she gave me was about how they would get weighed every week, but they wouldn't tell them what the weight was, in this sort of like controlling, uh, like this need to not just perform perfectly, but have this so-called perfect bodily appearance where, but it was highly controlling in the sense they never told them whether or not they'd met whatever it was this nebulous idea of constantly chasing the standard that they didn't know where the bar was. And I thought that was a really worrying practice. Um, and this is not from an example that I know, but it's in the literature somewhere. It's a very old publication, and it refers to elite level gymnastics in the US or Russia, perhaps. But it's about a coach who puts serrated bottle caps on the bottom of the gymnast's feet. So, like, a Coke bottle with the jagged edges. From a glass bottle, they put them on the bottom of the feet so that if they fell off the bar, they would be physically hurt. So it would be a sort of practice to avoid them to make any mistakes, which I think, some very enlightening examples of what might go on in these more extreme perfectionistic contexts.
Yeah, you can only hope that those with the amount of documentaries and investigations that have come out that those abusive behaviors are just changing. And I feel like if anything, they no doubt they will shift in some way, shape, or form into more subtle behaviors. And it goes back to that sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts could be the implicit actions and words that are not told directly, but just spoken around. Look, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on, and it's fascinating we could talk about this. This is like it's just like me going into the perfectionistic playground and just being able to play with all the toys for an hour. But maybe we'll run it back and do another episode in the
Yeah,
future and
no,
talk
yeah.
about some other areas. What's on the horizon for you? What's your area of interest at the moment? And then following on from that, where's the best place for people to follow what you're looking at and where you're at?
Yeah, so I think I'm just continuing in lots of ways to I try and peddle both lines of research in terms of looking at perfectionism as a personality trait, so the pressure that resides within people and their personalities, and all of the negative consequences that could come with. I'm doing hoping to do some research soon with a PhD student looking at the impact that it has on sleep. So I think that's a really relatively under researched area in terms of the impact that perfectionism has on sleep. This idea that we might ruminate more and struggle to get good sleep as a consequence of our brooding and worrying about future mistakes, past mistakes, and the like. So that's an exciting future area of research. And yeah, the climate stuff I think needs to continue through my own research of my students, and others. Hopefully, looking at you know what are the consequences of these environments? Is it the burnout, the depression, the increased risk of all these negative outcomes that we argue would be the case? So I think pushing that line of research is really important. And yeah, like in terms of following any sort of stuff, I use Twitter semi regularly. And I've got a ResearchGate profile, and I've got a university profile, of course. So, with an email address linked. So if anyone's interested in linking up, feel free to use one of the above.
Really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Grugan.
Yeah, thank you.
If you enjoyed that episode with Michael, then you might enjoy even more episodes of the show. And I put together a playlist that you can start with right away. All you got to do is click right here.